The massive doors of the Galactic Council chamber opened with a deep rumbling sound that made the human delegation feel even smaller than they already were. Captain Jake Morrison walked at the front of the group, his dark blue uniform pressed and clean, but he knew it looked primitive compared to the flowing energy suits and crystalline armor worn by the alien representatives around them. Behind him walked Admiral Lisa Blake, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, and her face showing no emotion even though Jake could feel the tension radiating from her. Commander Ryan Davis followed close behind, his young face trying hard to look confident, while his eyes took in the impossible architecture of the chamber that seemed to bend space itself. Dr. Amy Foster brought up the rear of their small group, her datapad clutched tightly in her hands and her scientific mind racing as she observed. Technologies that defied everything. Humans thought they knew about physics. The chamber itself was beyond anything Earth had ever imagined. The ceiling disappeared into what looked like folded space, creating the illusion of infinite height. Floating platforms held representatives from dozens of alien species, each more advanced and intimidating than the last. The Zephyrians sat on their platform with their 6 arms moving in complex patterns that Jake realized was probably some form of communication. Their blue-scaled skin caught the light from the chamber's energy sources, and their large black eyes looked down at the humans with obvious amusement. To their left, the reptilian Sauroch delegation hissed quietly among themselves, their forked tongues flicking out to taste the air. Their leader, a massive creature with dark green scales and yellow eyes, watched the humans approach with what Jake could only describe as hunger. The Sauroch had been one of the first species to achieve faster-than-light travel, and their empire stretched across 3 spiral arms of the galaxy. Above them all floated the Ethereal Collective, beings of pure energy contained within sleek mechanical shells that hummed with power. Their voices, when they spoke, came from speakers built into their containment units and sounded like multiple people talking at once in perfect harmony. But it was the insectoid Hivark that dominated the center of the chamber. The creature stood nearly 12 feet tall, its exoskeleton gleaming like polished black metal, and its forearms ending in delicate but obviously strong hands. Its head was elongated and its compound eyes reflected the light in thousands of tiny rainbows. When it spoke, its mandibles clicked together in a rhythm that somehow made its words sound even more condescending. So, the Hivark began, its voice carrying easily through the chamber, despite the fact that it seemed to be speaking quietly. The species that calls itself human has come to petition for membership in our ancient alliance. The word petition was spoken with such obvious mockery that Jake felt his hands clench into fists at his sides. He forced himself to remain calm and stepped forward to address the assembled council. "We come seeking partnership," Jake said, his voice clear and strong despite the overwhelming nature of their surroundings. "Humanity offers our unique perspective, our creativity, and our determination to contribute to the galactic community." The reaction was immediate and humiliating. The Zephyrians' 6 arms moved in what was clearly their equivalent of laughter. The Sauroch began hissing in a pattern that sounded like mockery in any language. Even the energy beings of the Ethereal Collective pulsed with colors that somehow conveyed amusement. Unique perspective. The Hivark's mandibles clicked rapidly. "Your species has barely managed to escape the gravity well of your single planet. You have established what you call colonies on 2 other worlds in your system. But these are nothing more than scientific outposts that require constant supply from your homeworld." Holographic displays materialized around the chamber, showing Earth's space installations in embarrassing detail. The International Space Station looked like a child's toy compared to the massive structures the other species had built. Humanity's moon base was revealed to be a collection of prefabricated modules that could house fewer than 100 people. The Mars colony was shown to be completely dependent on regular supply runs from Earth and had a population of less than 50. "Your transportation technology," continued another voice, this one belonging to a crystalline syndicate representative whose body was made of living crystal that chimed when it moved, "consists of chemical rockets that can barely achieve 1% of light speed. Our children master faster than light travel before they reach maturity." Admiral Blake stepped forward, her diplomatic training taking over. "Every species begins somewhere," she said calmly. "We are eager to learn and contribute. Our scientists have made remarkable progress in..." "Progress?" The interruption came from a Void Runner, a species that could phase in and out of normal space at will. The creature flickered between visibility and transparency as it spoke. Your most advanced computers process information at speeds we achieved 10,000 years ago. Your energy production relies on splitting atoms, a technology so primitive that we use it only in children's educational toys. The humiliation continued as more species joined in. The temporal lords, beings who existed simultaneously in past and future, spoke in overlapping voices that made Jake's head hurt. "We have observed your species' timeline," they said. "You will destroy yourselves with nuclear weapons within the next 500 years unless you are prevented from doing so. Your aggressive nature and short lifespans make you unsuitable for galactic civilization." Dr. Foster finally spoke up, her scientific training overriding her nervousness. "Our research shows significant potential for rapid advancement," she said, holding up her data pad. "Given access to advanced technologies and guidance from more experienced species, we could contribute meaningfully to..." Contribute? The laughter that erupted from the chamber was unlike anything the humans had ever experienced. It came in frequencies they could barely hear, in harmonics that made their bones vibrate, and in dimensional echoes that seemed to come from directions that didn't exist. The Hivarch raised one of its forearms for silence. "Your species measures time in decades," it said, its voice now carrying a tone of what almost sounded like pity. "We measure our projects in millennia. Your individual lifespans are so brief that you cannot even begin to understand the scope of galactic civilization. By the time you learned our most basic technologies, your entire species would have evolved into something unrecognizable." Furthermore, added a representative from the Dimensional Architects, a species that existed partially outside normal space-time, "you demonstrate none of the fundamental capabilities required for membership in this council. You cannot manipulate space-time. You have no understanding of dimensional mechanics, and your consciousness operates on only 3 dimensions while we routinely work with 7. Commander Davis finally lost his composure. "Give us a chance," he said, his young voice cracking slightly. "Humanity has overcome impossible odds before. We've survived ice ages, plagues, wars that should have destroyed us. We always find a way." The silence that followed was somehow worse than the laughter had been. Then the Hivarch spoke again, its words carrying a finality that made Jake's heart sink. "Your emotional appeals demonstrate exactly why you are unfit for membership," it said. "The universe operates according to physical laws, not feelings. Power in this galaxy belongs to species that have mastered the fundamental forces of reality. You still struggle to understand gravity." The session was over, though no one had officially dismissed them. The alien representatives simply turned away from the human delegation, their attention moving to other matters as if the humans had simply ceased to exist. Jake felt Admiral Blake's hand on his shoulder, guiding him toward the exit. As they walked through the massive doors that had seemed so impressive when they entered, Jake could hear the continuing discussions behind them. The aliens were already planning new territorial divisions, new trade agreements, new technological exchanges. None of these plans included humanity. The trip back to their shuttle passed in crushing silence. 6 months had passed since the humiliating rejection at the Galactic Council, and Commander Ben Tucker floated through the corridors of Facility Omega-7 with practiced ease. The massive underground complex had been carved deep into the asteroid Vesta over the past 8 years, hidden from all known scanning technologies by layers of specialized shielding that bent electromagnetic radiation around the facility, like water flowing around a rock. Tucker pushed off from a wall junction and glided toward the main construction bay, his magnetic boots clicking against the metal deck plating as he landed. Through the transparent aluminum windows, he could see the project that had consumed humanity's greatest minds and most classified resources for nearly a decade. The USS Liberation hung suspended in the zero-gravity construction bay, its hull gleaming under the harsh work lights. The ship was unlike anything humanity had ever built before. Where Earth's previous vessels were blocky and functional, the Liberation flowed like liquid metal frozen in motion. Its hull incorporated technologies that had been reverse-engineered from artifacts discovered in the outer reaches of the solar system, devices that predated human civilization by millions of years. Dr. Kate Stevens looked up from her workstation as Tucker approached, her tired eyes reflecting the strain of months spent working 18-hour days. Her brown hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and coffee stains marked her white lab coat. But her voice carried the excitement of someone on the verge of achieving the impossible. "The seventh-dimensional calculations are finally stabilizing," she reported, gesturing to the complex equations that covered every available screen around her workstation. "We've managed to create a stable interface between normal space and the seventh dimension. But the power requirements are enormous." Tucker studied the readouts, though he understood only the basic principles of what Stevens and her team had accomplished. "How enormous are we talking about?" "The dimensional drive requires the equivalent energy output of a small star," Stevens replied, pulling up a holographic display that showed the Liberation's power core. "We've had to develop an entirely new form of matter-antimatter reaction that operates across multiple dimensional layers simultaneously." General Paul Wright emerged from a nearby access tunnel, his weathered face showing the stress of commanding humanity's most desperate project. Wright had been chosen to lead Omega-7 specifically because of his experience managing impossible military operations, but even he sometimes felt overwhelmed by the scope of what they were attempting. "Dr. Stevens," Wright said as he approached the workstation, "I need a realistic timeline. How long before we can test the dimensional drive systems?" Stevens pulled up another set of calculations on her screen. "The drive cores are already functional," she explained, pointing to various components of the displayed ship design. "What we're struggling with is maintaining dimensional coherence while transitioning between normal space and the seventh dimension. Every time we run a simulation, the ship's molecular structure threatens to collapse." Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos walked up to join the conversation, her pilot's uniform crisp despite having spent the last 12 hours running system diagnostics. Santos had been selected to captain the Liberation after demonstrating an unusual ability to think in multiple dimensions simultaneously, a mental flexibility that the dimensional navigation systems required. "The coherence problem is getting better," Santos reported. "My navigation team has been working with Dr. Stevens to develop new stability protocols. We think the issue isn't with the ship's structure, but with how we're thinking about the dimensional transition itself." Wright raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Santos gestured toward the suspended ship. "Every other species in the galaxy developed dimensional technology gradually, starting with the fourth dimension and working their way up over thousands of years. They learned to think in higher dimensions slowly, adapting their consciousness to handle increasingly complex spatial relationships. But we don't have thousands of years," Tucker interjected. "Exactly," Santos continued. "So instead of trying to adapt our minds to think in 7 dimensions, we're designing the ship's computer systems to handle the dimensional mathematics while we operate it intuitively. The Liberation will exist simultaneously in all 7 dimensions, but the crew will interface with it as if we're still thinking in 3 dimensions." Dr. Stevens nodded enthusiastically. "It's like learning to fly a helicopter without understanding aerodynamics. You don't need to know why the controls work, just how to use them effectively." Engineer Carl Johnson looked up from where he was calibrating one of the dimensional resonance chambers, sweat beading on his forehead despite the facility's cool temperature. "The power coupling tests are showing 94% efficiency," he reported. "We're actually going to pull this off." Wright allowed himself a small smile, the first genuine expression of optimism he had shown in months. "What about the weapon systems?" Santos and Stevens exchanged a glance. "That's where things get really interesting," Santos said. "While we were learning to manipulate the 7th dimension, we discovered something the Galactic Council species apparently never figured out." She led the group to another workstation where a holographic model showed dimensional energy patterns flowing through complex geometric shapes. Every faster-than-light drive, every dimensional shield, every advanced weapon system used by the Council species operates by manipulating specific frequencies in the higher dimensions. "And those frequencies can be disrupted," Stevens continued, her voice carrying a note of satisfied revenge. "If you know exactly how 7th-dimensional space works, you can create interference patterns that collapse the dimensional effects that more advanced technologies depend on." Johnson wiped his hands on a rag and joined the conversation. "We've run the calculations 3 times," he said. "A single 7th-dimensional pulse from the Liberation should be able to disable the advanced systems of any ship within a light-year radius." Wright felt a cold smile spread across his face. "So while they're laughing at our primitive technology, we'll have the ability to reduce their advanced ships to the same primitive level." Tucker shook his head in amazement. The irony is perfect. They rejected us for being too primitive, but our primitive perspective is exactly what allowed us to see a solution they missed. There's more, Santos added. Because we're approaching seventh-dimensional manipulation from a completely different angle than the established galactic species, our technology is completely invisible to their sensors. Their scanning systems are designed to detect dimensional manipulation that follows the conventional development path. Stevens pulled up a star chart showing the positions of known Galactic Council fleets. As far as their instruments can tell, we're still using chemical rockets and nuclear fusion. They have no idea that we've not only achieved seventh-dimensional capability, but that we've weaponized it in ways they never considered possible. The facility's communication system crackled to life, and Admiral Blake's voice came through from Earth Command. Omega-7, this is Admiral Blake. The Galactic Council has just announced new territorial restrictions around our solar system. They're treating us like animals in a zoo. Wright stepped up to the communication console. What kind of restrictions, Admiral? They've established what they call a primitive species preservation zone around our entire system. Blake's voice carried barely controlled anger. No human vessel is allowed to travel beyond the orbit of Pluto without Council permission. They've also banned us from developing any technology they consider potentially dangerous. The silence in the facility stretched for several seconds before Wright responded. Admiral, please inform the Galactic Council that humanity has received their message and will respond appropriately. Santos looked at the suspended form of the Liberation, its alien hull gleaming under the work lights. How long before we can make them regret underestimating us? Stevens consulted her latest calculations. 2 weeks for final systems integration, another week for full-dimensional drive testing. If everything goes according to plan, the Liberation will be ready for its first seventh-dimensional transition in just under a month. Wright nodded grimly. Then we'd better hope everything goes according to plan. Humanity's future depends on proving that sometimes being primitive is exactly the advantage you need. The Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Council's primary station stretched impossibly far in all directions, its architecture defying the basic laws of physics that humans understood. The station itself orbited a massive blue giant star at the center of the galaxy, drawing power directly from the stellar core through dimensional conduits that had been built by civilizations that existed before most current species had even evolved. Representatives from thousands of worlds filled the floating platforms that hung suspended throughout the vast space. The air itself seemed alive with translation fields and dimensional communication networks, allowing beings from radically different environments and realities to participate in the same gathering. High Counselor Zeth Ra floated at the center of the assembly, its body composed of crystallized dark matter that bent light around it in impossible patterns. When it spoke, its voice carried through multiple dimensions simultaneously, reaching every representative regardless of their native communication methods or dimensional phase state. Fellow counselors, Zeth Ra began, its words creating visible ripples in the space around it. We gather today to address the final disposition of the species that calls itself human. A wave of what could only be described as anticipation rolled through the assembly. The various alien races had been discussing the human problem for months, ever since their embarrassing appearance before the Council had become a source of galaxy-wide entertainment. Captain Jake Morrison stood alone on a small platform near the center of the hall, his hands and feet bound by energy restraints that suppressed his molecular structure and prevented any possibility of escape or violence. The restraints were considered a mere formality, since no primitive species had ever developed technology capable of overriding them, but Council protocol demanded their use when dealing with potentially hostile primitive life forms. Admiral Lisa Blake stood on a similar platform nearby, her diplomatic training helping her maintain composure, despite the humiliating circumstances. The energy restraints created a constant tingling sensation throughout her body and made it difficult to think clearly, but she forced herself to focus on the proceedings. The human delegation appeared before this council 8 months ago, Zeth Ra continued, requesting membership in our ancient alliance despite their obvious technological and evolutionary inadequacies. After careful consideration, we rejected their petition and established monitoring protocols for their species. The Zephyrian delegate raised 4 of its 6 arms in a gesture that indicated a desire to speak. High Counselor, it said, its voice carrying the musical tones that characterized its species' communication. Our monitoring stations have detected no significant advancement in human technology during the observation period. They continue to rely on chemical propulsion and nuclear fusion, confirming our assessment of their primitive status. Harmonious laughter echoed through the assembly hall as other representatives expressed their amusement at humanity's continued technological stagnation. The Sauroch delegation hissed their approval while the crystalline syndicate chimed like wind instruments made of living crystal. Indeed, responded a Void Runner, its form flickering between visible reality and the spaces between dimensions. Our temporal scanning indicates that the human species will likely destroy itself within the next 5 centuries through nuclear warfare or environmental collapse. Their aggressive nature and short lifespans make them unsuitable for preservation as a protected species. High Counselor Zeth Ra pulsed with darker patterns of crystallized matter. Which brings us to today's primary agenda item. The Council must vote on the implementation of the Primitive Accords, formally classifying humanity as a protected primitive species under Galactic Law 7.4 Alpha. Captain Morrison tried to speak, but the energy restraints had been calibrated to prevent vocal communication above a whisper. His words came out as barely audible sounds that were easily ignored by the assembled delegates. A holographic display materialized above the assembly, showing the human solar system in detailed 3-dimensional representation. The display highlighted Earth's modest space installations, the small research stations on Mars and Europa, and the primitive nuclear vessels that represented humanity's most advanced spacecraft. Under the Primitive Accords, Zeth Ra explained, the human solar system will be enclosed within a dimensional barrier, preventing any human vessel from traveling beyond their outermost planet. This barrier will be permeable only to Council-approved vessels conducting research or resource extraction operations. The ethereal collective pulsed with colors that conveyed satisfaction. The Primitive Accords will also prohibit the human species from developing any technology that could potentially threaten galactic stability, they said in their harmonized voices. This includes faster-than-light travel, dimensional manipulation, artificial intelligence beyond basic computational levels, and any form of energy generation more advanced than controlled fusion. Admiral Blake managed to force her voice loud enough to be heard despite the restraints. You cannot imprison an entire species, she said, her words carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades in diplomatic service. This violates every principle of galactic law and interspecies ethics. The response was immediate mockery from dozens of species simultaneously. The temporal lords rippled with temporal distortions that indicated their amusement while the dimensional architects shifted their forms to exist partially outside normal spacetime, in what appeared to be their equivalent of laughter. Galactic law, repeated the Hivarch representative, its mandibles clicking in rapid patterns, applies only to species capable of understanding and participating in galactic civilization. Your species lacks the fundamental cognitive abilities required for meaningful participation in interdimensional society. Another holographic display appeared, this one showing comparative technological capabilities across different species. Humanity's achievements appeared as tiny points of light, compared to the blazing stars that represented the capabilities of council member species. Furthermore, added a representative from the neural collective, a species of linked consciousness that existed as pure thought. Your individual minds operate on such limited dimensional parameters that you cannot even perceive the true nature of the universe around you. To you, space has 3 dimensions and time moves in a single direction. You are intellectually incapable of comprehending the 7-dimensional reality in which advanced civilization operates. The Void Runner delegate phased back into normal reality long enough to add its voice to the discussion. The dimensional barrier we will construct around your system will be invisible and undetectable to your primitive sensors. From your perspective, nothing will change. You will simply find that your spacecraft experience inexplicable system failures whenever they attempt to travel beyond your outermost planet. Captain Morrison found his voice despite the restraints. History will judge this decision, he said, his words barely audible but carrying absolute conviction. Every species in this assembly will regret underestimating humanity. The laughter that followed was unlike anything either human had ever experienced. It came in frequencies they could barely hear, in harmonics that made their bones ache, and in dimensional echoes that seemed to originate from directions that shouldn't exist. High Counselor Zethra raised an appendage for silence. "History," it said, its voice now carrying tones that almost sounded like pity, "is written by species that master time itself. Your civilization will be extinct long before you develop the capability to influence galactic events in any meaningful way." The vote, when it came, was unanimous. Every species represented in the assembly voted to implement the primitive accords. The dimensional barrier around humanity's solar system would be constructed within the next standard galactic month, effectively turning the entire human species into a museum exhibit for more advanced civilizations to study. As the assembly began to disperse, the various alien representatives discussing implementation details and resource allocation for maintaining the barrier, neither Morrison nor Blake could have imagined that their species' salvation was already taking shape in the hidden depths of an asteroid between Mars and Jupiter. The greatest mistake in galactic history had just been made by unanimous vote. The celebration in the Galactic Council's assembly hall came to an abrupt halt when every dimensional scanning array across the galaxy simultaneously detected something that should not exist. The readings cascaded across thousands of monitoring stations, each one confirming the impossible data that their instruments were recording. High Counselor. Zethra's crystallized dark matter form shifted from the satisfied patterns of successful legislation to the chaotic swirls of confusion and alarm. The being's voice, when it spoke, carried harmonics of disbelief that resonated through multiple dimensions at once. "What is this anomaly?" Zethra demanded, its words creating visible distortions in the space around the assembly hall. "All scanning stations report detecting a massive seventh-dimensional emergence directly above our primary station." The various alien representatives turned their attention from their post-vote discussions to the sensor displays that were materializing throughout the hall. The readings showed something that violated everything they understood about dimensional physics and the natural order of technological development. The ethereal collective's energy forms pulsed frantically within their mechanical containment units, their harmonized voices becoming discordant with panic. "Impossible," they chorused. "Nothing can maintain molecular coherence during a direct transition from the seventh dimension to standard spacetime. The energy requirements alone would destroy any known material." Above the council station, in the seemingly empty space between dimensions, reality began to fold inward on itself like origami made from the fabric of spacetime itself. The process was visible to beings that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously, but to those limited to three-dimensional perception, it appeared as if space was simply becoming wrinkled and distorted. Captain Maria Santos stood on the bridge of the USS Liberation, her hands gripping the command chair's armrests as the ship completed its transition from the seventh dimension into normal space. Around her, the bridge crew worked at stations that incorporated technologies no human had dreamed possible just a decade earlier. "All stations report ready, Captain," announced Navigator Tony Chen from his position at the Dimensional Coordination Console. His voice was steady despite the fact that he was helping to pilot humanity's first vessel, capable of existing simultaneously across 7 different dimensions of reality. "Dimensional stabilizers are holding at optimal levels," reported Lieutenant Sam Parker from the engineering station. "All 7-dimensional drives are synchronized and maintaining stable phase relationships with normal spacetime." The Liberation's hull gleamed with energy matrices that bent spacetime around the ship. Like water flowing around a smooth stone, the vessel appeared to exist in normal space while simultaneously extending into dimensions that most species required millennia of technological development to access. Chief Engineer Carl Johnson's voice crackled over the intercom from the engine room deep within the ship. "Captain, all dimensional drive systems are operating within acceptable parameters. We're maintaining stable existence across dimensional barriers that the Council claimed were impossible to breach without gradual evolutionary adaptation." The Council chamber erupted into chaos as the impossible became undeniably real before the eyes of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations. The Zephyrian 6 arms moved in frantic patterns of disbelief, while the Sorok delegation hissed in frequencies that indicated severe distress. "This cannot be happening," shrieked the HFY representative, its compound eyes reflecting the Liberation's impossible presence in thousands of tiny fragments. "No species can achieve seventh-dimensional mastery without thousands of years of gradual technological evolution. Their neural structures are too simple to comprehend the mathematics involved. The temporal lords, beings that existed simultaneously across past and future, began experiencing temporal distortions as they tried to peer into possible futures, only to find their precognitive abilities scrambled by humanity's achievement. Their overlapping voices became confused and contradictory as they attempted to process a present that their past observations had deemed impossible. Captain Santos opened a communication channel that broadcast simultaneously across all 7 dimensions, reaching every member of the Galactic Council, regardless of their dimensional phase state or communication method. Her voice carried the calm confidence of someone who had just redefined what the universe considered possible. "Members of the Galactic Council," she began, her words resonating through normal space and 6 additional dimensional layers with perfect clarity. "I am Captain Maria Santos of the United Earth Vessel Liberation. I represent the human species that you recently classified as primitive and unsuitable for galactic civilization." The silence that followed lasted exactly 7.3 seconds, across all monitored dimensional frequencies. It was a pause that would be recorded in galactic history, as the moment when the established order of the universe shifted on its axis. "We have come to discuss the terms of humanity's membership in the Galactic Council," Santos continued, her voice carrying no trace of the humiliation that her species had endured during their previous appearance before the Assembly. "The Void Runners, who prided themselves on their ability to phase between dimensions at will, found themselves unable to shift their dimensional state. Their forms flickered desperately between visibility and transparency as they realized that something was interfering with their most fundamental ability. How? The question escaped from High Counselor Zethra as barely more than a whisper, but it carried across multiple dimensions with the force of a shout. "Your species was classified as technologically primitive less than a standard year ago. Our most advanced sensors detected no significant technological development in your civilization." Dr. Amy Foster's voice joined the transmission from the Liberation Science Station, her words carrying the satisfaction of a researcher whose theories had just been proven correct, against impossible odds. "Council members, you measured our potential using your own evolutionary timeline as a baseline. You assumed that technological advancement must follow the same gradual path that your species traveled over thousands of years." Commander Tony Chen monitored the tactical displays that showed the positions of 17 different council fleets converging on their location from multiple dimensional vectors. "Captain," he reported quietly, "we're detecting massive power buildups from council military forces. They're attempting to coordinate an attack using conventional 3-dimensional tactics, supplemented by 4th and 5th dimensional maneuvering." "Thank you, Commander," Santos replied calmly, then addressed the council directly. "We are aware of your military response, council members. Before you proceed with what I assume you believe will be a demonstration of superior firepower, perhaps you would be interested to learn what humanity discovered during our period of enforced isolation. The USS Liberation began to demonstrate capabilities that redefined the possible. The ship shifted through dimensional phases, becoming partially transparent as it existed simultaneously across all 7 dimensions of spacetime. The Council's most sophisticated sensors could barely track its position as it flickered between realities like a ghost made of living metal. Dr. Kate Stevens' voice joined the transmission from the Liberation's Dimensional Research Laboratory. "While mapping the 7th dimension to achieve our current capabilities, we made an interesting discovery about the fundamental nature of advanced technology. The dimensional barriers that your species use for faster-than-light travel, for your defensive shields, for your most powerful weapons, all depend on specific resonance frequencies within higher dimensional space. Those frequencies," Stevens continued, her voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of a scientist about to reveal a revolutionary discovery, "can be disrupted by properly calibrated 7th dimensional interference patterns." The 17 council fleets that had been converging on the Liberation's position suddenly found their advanced systems failing in ways that their crews had never experienced. Weapons that could destroy planets became inoperative. Shields that could deflect stellar energy collapsed, and faster-than-light drives that had functioned perfectly for millennia simply stopped working. Across the galaxy, thousands of vessels belonging to the most advanced civilizations known to exist found themselves reduced to operating on the same primitive technological level that they had mocked humanity for being limited to. The silence that followed the complete failure of the Council's military forces stretched across 17 different dimensional frequencies for what felt like an eternity. Thousands of the galaxy's most advanced warships hung motionless in space, their crews staring at control panels that displayed nothing but error messages and system failures that should have been impossible. High Counselor, Zethra's crystallized dark matter form had lost all coherent patterns, becoming a swirling mass of confusion and disbelief. When it finally spoke, its voice carried frequencies that other council members had never heard before, tones that suggested the being was experiencing something completely outside its previous reality. "This is not possible," Zethra whispered, its words creating barely visible ripples in the space around it. "The seventh dimension cannot be weaponized. The mathematical complexity alone would require computational abilities that exceed the processing power of entire stellar civilizations." Captain Maria Santos stood calmly on the Liberation's bridge, watching the tactical displays that showed the disabled council fleet scattered throughout local space like toys that had suddenly stopped working. Her crew moved efficiently around their stations, monitoring systems that operated according to principles that the galaxy's greatest scientists had considered purely theoretical until this moment. "Council members," Santos said, her voice carrying easily across all dimensional frequencies, "I believe there has been a fundamental misunderstanding about humanity's capabilities and our place in galactic civilization." The ethereal collectives, energy forms pulsed desperately. Within their mechanical containment units, their harmonized voices becoming increasingly frantic. "How did you achieve seventh-dimensional manipulation?" they demanded. "Our species required 12,000 years of gradual technological evolution to reach fourth-dimensional understanding. The neural pathways necessary for seventh-dimensional mathematics cannot develop without millennia of evolutionary adaptation." Dr. Amy Foster stepped forward from her science station, her voice carrying the patient tone of a teacher explaining basic concepts to confused students. "That assumption is precisely where your thinking went wrong," she said. "You believed that consciousness had to adapt to understand higher dimensions. But we approached the problem differently." She gestured to the Liberation's bridge displays, which showed dimensional equations that flowed and shifted like living things. "Instead of trying to evolve our brains to think in 7 dimensions, we created technology that translates 7-dimensional relationships into 3-dimensional concepts we can understand intuitively." Commander Tony Chen looked up from his navigation console. "Captain, the Council fleets are attempting to restart their systems, but our 7th-dimensional interference field is maintaining a stable disruption pattern. They're completely unable to access any technology more advanced than basic chemical propulsion." "Maintain current interference levels, Commander," Santos replied, then addressed the Council again. "We want you to understand something important about human nature. When you told us we were too primitive to join your civilization, you gave us the greatest motivation possible: desperation. The temporal lords, still experiencing chaotic temporal distortions that prevented them from accessing their precognitive abilities, spoke in overlapping voices that betrayed their panic. "Desperation cannot overcome the fundamental laws of physics," they said. "Advanced dimensional manipulation requires specific, evolutionary developments that your species has not had time to achieve." General Paul Wright's voice crackled through the communication system from the hidden Omega-7 facility. "Council members," he said, his words carrying the authority of someone who had spent years preparing for this exact moment. "You made the mistake of assuming that all species must follow the same technological development path that you followed." The massive construction bay doors at Omega-7 began to open, revealing not just one impossible vessel, but an entire fleet of ships incorporating 7th-dimensional technology. The Liberation had not been humanity's only project, merely the first to be completed. "While you were debating how to imprison us within our own solar system," Wright continued, "humanity was building the tools necessary to ensure that such imprisonment would never be possible." Dr. Kate Stevens appeared on the communication channel from her laboratory aboard the Liberation. "The irony of your situation should not be lost on you," she said, her voice carrying a note of scientific satisfaction. You rejected us for being too primitive, but our primitive perspective allowed us to solve a problem that your advanced thinking had made impossible to see. Your species spent thousands of years gradually mastering each dimension in sequence, Stevens explained. This approach created mental frameworks that made seventh-dimensional manipulation seem impossibly complex. But because we approached the problem as complete beginners, we were able to develop solutions that bypassed the complexity entirely. The Void Runners, still unable to phase between dimensions, flickered desperately as they tried to access abilities that had defined their species for millennia. You cannot simply bypass complexity, one of them managed to say. The seventh dimension exists in mathematical relationships that require thinking about the problem differently, interrupted engineer Carl Johnson from the Liberation's engine room. Your species learned to manipulate dimensions by understanding them completely. We learned to manipulate dimensions by building machines that understand them for us. High Counselor Zethra's form began to stabilize into new patterns that suggested a fundamental shift in thinking. "What do you want from us?" it asked, its voice now carrying tones of respect that had never been directed toward humanity before. Captain Santos smiled, an expression that somehow translated across dimensional barriers to every species present. "We want exactly what we requested during our first appearance before this council. Membership in the galactic community as equals, with full voting rights and territorial recognition." The crystalline syndicate chimed with frequencies that indicated deep consideration. "And if we refuse?" The Liberation began to demonstrate additional capabilities, phasing through dimensions in patterns that created visual effects unlike anything the council members had ever witnessed. "Then you will discover what happens when a species you consider primitive decides to reshape galactic civilization according to their own vision," Santos replied. Captain Jake Morrison's voice joined the communication from where he stood, still in energy restraints on his platform in the council chamber. "We told you that history would remember this moment," he said. "We told you that every species in this assembly would regret underestimating humanity. But we also told you something else," Admiral Lisa Blake added from her nearby platform. "We told you that humanity offers our unique perspective, our creativity, and our determination to contribute to the galactic community. That offer still stands." The council members looked around at each other, seeing their most advanced fleets reduced to chemical propulsion, and their dimensional technologies rendered completely inoperative by a species they had classified as primitive less than a year earlier. "High Counselor," Zethra raised an appendage in the formal gesture of acknowledgement. "The Galactic Council recognizes the technological sovereignty of the human species," it announced, its voice carrying across all dimensional frequencies. "Humanity is granted immediate full membership status with all rights and privileges thereof." The energy restraints around Morrison and Blake dissolved, freeing them for the first time since their capture. Morrison straightened his uniform and looked directly at the assembled council members. "We appreciate your recognition," he said formally. "Humanity looks forward to contributing to galactic civilization as equals, not as subjects or primitives, but as partners in building a better future for all species." As the USS Liberation maintained its position above the council station, demonstrating effortless control over 7 dimensions, while the galaxy's most advanced civilization sat powerless around it, a new chapter in galactic history began. The species that had mocked humanity for thinking in only 3 dimensions now faced the reality that sometimes the greatest advantage comes from being underestimated. The 7th dimension had emerged, and with it, humanity had claimed their rightful place among the stars.